If you've ever been in a social situation, having a conversation with someone or at a gathering, and someone says or does something that triggers you in such a way that you feel yourself shut down, start going really inward, getting anxious, and wanting to run away, this video is for you. Sometimes I find myself in certain social situations where someone will say or do something that just sort of instantly triggers this avoidant or shutting down reaction in me. And this is something that I am starting to recognize that I've done for quite some time as kind of a dysfunctional coping mechanism to social anxiety, I guess. Uh, but it's been a little bit more in my mind lately because I've been noticing it in myself for one thing, but for another thing, I've been getting some feedback from people close to me that I do this and how uncomfortable it is for everyone involved. So it's been a great excuse to really look in the mirror and try to dissect and unfold what's going on here and to actually practice with some ways to overcome this and to sort of bring myself back to reality and not let myself get so overwhelmed or triggered or shut down when certain events happen or people say certain things or trigger me in some way. So I'll use the expressions shutting down or sudden onset anxiety or sudden onset avoidance kind of interchangeably throughout this video, kind of depending on the context of what I'm talking about, but they all essentially mean the same thing for all intents and purposes, which is I'll be in a certain type of social situation, someone will say or do something, and then all of a sudden I get this overwhelming feeling, this overwhelming sense of emotional, physical avoidance, shutting down, anxiety, etc. Like I said, I've been told that this is very uncomfortable and that it, I quote, feels like all the air gets sucked out of the room when I get in this state. It's definitely embarrassing. It's not something I want to do. It's not a way I want to show up. But it can kind of become a bit of a feedback cycle where the more it happens, the worse and kind of deeper it gets, and it's harder to break out of. I'll elaborate on that a little bit more. And my excuse has always been that if I'm feeling negative or feeling anxiety or whatever, that the most polite thing I can do in a social situation is to say nothing, because that's exactly what I do when this happens. I'm normally a fairly chatty person, but when I get in this state, I really am not contributing to conversations. If I am, it's usually terse responses, one-word answers. But I think it's really important to unpack stuff like this when you become aware of any pattern that you have when you're socializing with people, even positive patterns. But today we're sort of focusing on a negative pattern. But when you notice these patterns, I think it's really good to dissect these and try to get really honest with yourself about what's going on, what the trigger is, what you're doing. Are you doing this reaction or response from a place of intentionality, or is it just very reactive? And from this place, we can begin to work on it and try to get some control back. That way we can actually show up and be present the way that we want to more often. So what I'd love to do in this video is unpack exactly what the triggers are or can be for this avoidance or shutting down behavior, what the feelings are in the body, and some of the thoughts and feelings that come from the mind and the emotions when this is happening as well. Talk about the types of scenarios and situations in which these responses can be triggered easily, and then talk about some positive coping mechanisms and things we can do to overcome this, some great long-term strategies, because usually with these negative coping mechanisms that are a bit dysfunctional, they're kind of successful in a short-term sense of protecting you from whatever situation you're in, but there are long-term consequences that we'll discuss later. But I want to talk about that and also talk about some alternative things that we can do when we get triggered in situations like this that will help us right in that moment, but also continue to help us even more and more over time. So what does it feel like physically when one of these triggers happens? You probably already know this in your subconscious, but a lot of people, when they get triggered, when they get anxiety, they're really just thinking thoughts and they're not noticing so much what's going on in the body. Sometimes noticing what's going on in your body when you're having a response, especially negative response, can actually help bring you back to reality. So What this feels like, at least for me, is a heavy tightness of the chest, almost kind of like there's a tourniquet that's being twisted around my chest or someone's sitting on my chest. A feeling of like high blood pressure, like you can almost feel your heart beating kind of throughout your whole body in a really strong way. A sense of increased heart rate, a feeling of getting very hot and flushed in the face. Also, kind of a narrowing of the visual focus where you're kind of looking, but you're not really seeing a lot, or you're just seeing what's right in front of you. And you're usually looking at either like a corner to try to not engage with someone, or looking at an escape route, like a door or hallway or something like that. Now, emotionally, without getting into specific thoughts, but emotionally, there are feelings of irritability, feelings of stress, feeling overwhelmed, like everything or the situation is just too much. You just can't handle it. There can also be an emotional sense of wanting to flee or disengage or remove yourself from the situation. So, what types of events happen that trigger this shutting down or this sudden onset anxiety or avoidance? It can be different for everyone. We're all going to have specific triggers that are probably related to some childhood trauma in some way, but I think there are some universal ones that most people can relate to. This could be a confrontational person, especially someone that has like you have like a repeated history of confrontation with. You can kind of already be on edge when you see this person, and you're just kind of ready to go into that fight or flight mode or to that triggered mode. It can be a very overstimulating environment with lots of people. Like think about being in the middle of a huge crowd at a theme park or a mall or something like that, where you're like body to body and there's unexpected sounds happening all over the place. It can also be proximity with a family member that we have some issues with or have some past trauma with, whether it's abuse or whether we have this sense of getting constant disapproval from them, or they're challenging us, or not recognizing our value repeatedly over time. We can get very easily triggered when we're around these people. Generally, when it comes to specific people, we get most easily triggered by the ones that we're closest to. For me, I have a few of these triggers that tend to pretty consistently send me into the shutdown mode if I don't kind of get it under control quickly. One of them is being around couples that are fighting or bickering with each other. I'm not exactly sure why, but that just really sends me into full shutdown mode, just sort of emotionally and physically disengaged, like I'm just in outer space trying to not be there, and it's very hard to come back from that. I also, for some reason, tend to get really triggered when people, especially people that I'm really close to, are kind of caught in an indecision or analysis paralysis cycle on a problem, and they are just vocalizing, oh, well, what about this? Oh, but that could affect this, and it's like just this kind of cyclical or circular thinking that doesn't come in for a landing, or where there's no clear solution in sight. For some reason, that really triggers me. And being around people, especially, again, people that are close to me that are exhibiting very strong negative emotions or stress, particularly if it's negative emotions or stress about their relationships or their work. So before I break into the nitty-gritty details of what happens when these negative coping mechanisms come about, this shutting down, what does that do? What does it look like? What are the long-term and short-term consequences, etc.? What I do want to quickly state is that I think it's very important to work on our triggers, work on identifying them, learning how to manage them, avoid them if necessary, or to learn better coping mechanisms, ways we can stay present and stay positive. I do feel it's very important to state that we are not entitled to live a life without any triggers in it. Everyone has unique triggers. Life is triggering. Life is hard. Unexpected things happen. Things out of our control happen. There's really nothing you can do to avoid that for the most part. So I state this in sort of the twofold purpose of empowering you, that you don't have to think of yourself as the helpless victim of a world full of triggers and just trying to shield yourself, as trying to empower you that you can take charge of your triggers and learn how to manage them well. So it can kind of be an empowering perspective. Additionally, you cannot impose control on the people around you to make them not trigger you. Of course, you can boundary set with people, which is really good, but there is a fine line that gets a little bit blurred nowadays between boundary setting for yourself to protect yourself versus trying to control and manipulate and change other people to suit what you want. And it's very important to note the difference here between setting a boundary and managing your triggers versus trying to control the people around you to make sure they don't trigger you. We don't really have the right to do that in most cases. So I want to break down these negative coping strategies that I've mentioned into a bit more detail and show you how it can become kind of a vicious cycle that's very hard to break from sometimes. So the three parts of the cycle are shutting down, negative self-talk, and avoidance. And each of these really feed into each other. So it starts with, at least for me, it starts with the shutting down. So I'll experience one of those triggers that I mentioned before. I might be around hanging out with a couple, and then all of a sudden they start fighting about something, or I'm visiting with someone, and then they're kind of like stuck on this problem and going in this cyclic thinking, analysis paralysis thing where there just doesn't seem to be any solution in sight, and I start to very, very quickly get this feeling of shutting down. And like I mentioned before, it's a narrowing of the visual focus. It's the increased heart rate and blood pressure, the tightness in the chest, etc. So that's how it starts. And then there's also the emotional shutting down, where it's like feeling the sense of like kind of overwhelmed and panicky, want to get out of here kind of a feeling. But the insidious thing is, I know right away that this has happened. Like, I know that I'm shutting down, and I can see very quickly that the other people in my proximity can tell I'm shutting down. I can see that it's affecting them. And what this does is this triggers the next phase of the cycle, which is the negative self-talk. So then I start getting very guilty and embarrassed and kind of filled with shame about shutting down, because I'm like thinking, John, you should be able to, control yourself better than this. You shouldn't be getting so easily triggered and overwhelmed by stuff that's going on with other people. It's not really fair to them or yourself. It's not really logical. It doesn't make any sense. And, you can tell that it's making the other person feel even worse about that than whatever their starting situation was. And that makes me shut down more because like the more I'm shutting down and the more I'm feeling guilty and shameful about it, the worse I feel, which makes it present more obvious, which makes the other person react in a certain way, which reinforces the way I'm feeling. Vicious cycle, terrible. So it inevitably this shutdown kind of lasts for me usually anywhere from like half an hour to half a day. Fortunately, it's not like a days long thing, this really extreme state of being shut down, but it lasts long enough that it usually is kind of the end of whatever situation I'm in. And usually it results in me just kind of exiting in some way, physically actually leaving the space or the situation, whatever it is. And this leads to the next phase of the cycle, which is avoidance. And basically, the more often that I get triggered and shut down by certain people, certain situations, I avoid those because I'm afraid of that happening again. And I'm afraid not so much of the trigger itself, like of the people doing the behaviors that trigger me, but I'm mostly afraid of me being in that shutdown state and the real intense self-loathing and negative self-talk that ensues. So a lot of times I find myself as I get older kind of being a bit more socially avoidant and liking to be alone more and more because it's safer. It's emotionally safe. At least it seems so. At least in the short term it is. I want to briefly speculate and discuss why we may gravitate towards these negative coping mechanisms like this, because any sort of like negative coping mechanism we have, it at one point in time was the best strategy that we had to escape or get out of or survive a stressful or dangerous situation, at least in that moment in the short term. So, if you are having a very heated conversation with someone or heated confrontation, shutting down can potentially sort of de-escalate the situation, because instead of having like two angry people butting heads, you've just got one. The other person kind of shuts down, and then it kind of fizzles out. Literally wanting to physically leave or avoid a person, it's a way of avoiding conflict, a way of avoiding a dangerous situation. This can be a useful strategy, or it may have been a useful strategy to you in the past when you were a little kid and you had very little control or power over your life or circumstances. And just for the sake of being a devil's advocate, I could steel man that there is a certain amount of negative self-talk that can be helpful in the sense of being a critic of yourself from the spirit of using that as a space to try to grow or build or improve yourself. Is kind of like calling out your weaknesses so that you can conquer them and build up and get stronger. But unfortunately, the long-term reality and consequence of these negative coping mechanisms is it has a really negative impact on your relationships with those people that especially you're close to, that are most likely or most apt to trigger you or for you to be triggered by them. Because over time, when you spend time around these people, you're going to be coming right out the gate on guard, because you've begun to create an association of being triggered, and you want to avoid being triggered. You want to avoid the shutdown. So you'll kind of have walls up, maybe not be as vulnerable or as trusting, and show up as authentically in those relationships. And you may even just avoid these people or situations altogether. So as I said, this can have a bad long-term effect. It can erode at the strength of these relationships and depth of these relationships as you avoid any sort of negativity, any negative conversations. But thing is, this is real life. Real life is not sunshine and roses, as we all know. In fact, it rarely is. So if you avoid the hard times, the negative conversations, the stressful interactions, you're not really going to have any relationships, because relationships have that. That's just part of it. And by avoiding it, you're going to wind up just being alone. And this goes back into the negative self-talk and the impact that this can all have on your self-esteem and your self-confidence, because over time, by doing these strategies, you possibly, or I definitely, gain an increased sense of having a lack of resilience and emotional fortitude, which makes me feel kind of bad about myself, like make me feel like I'm a loser, like I'm not a strong person. And it's like I should be able to handle more. And that all said, this is a very nuanced conversation. This is a nuanced subject or area. It's not black and white. I'm not trying to advocate that you just force yourself to be in stressful situations and stressful conversations or around people that stress you out. There are definitely people and situations that you should avoid that are good to not take part in. There are people that you should not have relationships with, people that you should have hard boundaries with. The purpose of this video is to bring awareness to the ways in which you may be subconsciously showing up or reacting to situations in a certain way, so that you can actually get empowered and gain a bit of self-awareness and control, so that you can really act and react from a place of emotional sobriety rather than just complete reactivity. So what can we do about all this? What are the tools and exercises that we can use to help overcome these triggers and to get some control back, to be a bit less reactive, and to just get more empowered in the situation so that we can show up the way we want and stay present. There's a few different tools and exercises I'm going to mention. I will say, sort of as a asterisk before I get into these, that there are a million different ways to practice mindfulness that are so accessible now, and so many people have done amazing content on. There's free apps and tools and YouTube videos you can follow along with for meditation, for gratitude practice, for journaling, all this stuff. I do think generally having a baseline of doing this stuff can really help with this stuff that we've been discussing today. But I want to give a few things that relate very specifically to this situation. The first is awareness of your tendency to get triggered by certain people and situations so that you can know what you're getting into and prepare yourself. Now, this is not to say to go in walls up, guard up. The goal of all this is to be able to show up as open and authentically in all of our relationships as possible. But it is good to, in order to solve this problem, we first need to be aware of the problem, aware of when it tends to arise. So awareness, as I said, of the people that tend to trigger us and the situations in which we tend to get triggered. The second is the awareness that someone else's stress and their problems or their anxiety or their fighting with their partner or whatever, that is not your burden. It is not your cross to bear. And I think a lot of this getting triggered by that type of stuff specifically is if you're a deeply empathetic person, you kind of absorb those negative feelings and that burden without really even wanting to or meaning to. And it can sort of feel like your problem to solve when you don't actually have to do anything. If someone is stressed out or having a hard time, the best thing you can do is actually just to be there and be present and open. You don't have to make it your problem or solve the problem. You certainly don't have to absorb and then reflect back negative, toxic feelings. That's certainly not going to help. So like I said, that awareness that, hey, this person's stuff is not my stuff. I'm okay. Also, they're okay, even though they're going through a moment. They're an individual. They're a human. They possess abilities to get through what they need to get through in their life. And we don't need to absorb that into ourselves. The second overarching key or tool is paying attention. And when I say pay attention, I don't necessarily mean in terms of being an active conversationalist, although that is part of it. But in these moments when you're getting triggered, paying attention to just your objective reality that's around you. That is the physical reality, where you are, what you can see and interface with in your environment, not the mental world that we all have where we're playing out different scenarios in our heads all the time and interpreting things and remembering things and getting triggered, but paying attention to the literal physical world that's right there. And also, when we are getting triggered, to pay attention to the physical feelings and the thoughts that pop into our head, not in a way of kind of getting lost in it, but in a way of looking at it from sort of like a third party of like, okay, oh, this feels like I'm getting triggered. I feel the tightness in my chest. I feel like I'm getting hot and flushed. Oh, I'm starting to feel overwhelmed. But actually to say that to yourself in your head, notice these things, that can really help because you're not getting lost in the negative fantasy of ruminations and situations in your head. You're actually just noticing, hey, these are my symptoms of getting triggered. This is what's happening. I'm going to, in a way, try to compartmentalize and remove my agency from all that. And in doing research and writing for this video, I discovered this really interesting exercise for grounding or paying attention, bringing yourself back to objective reality. You watching this may have heard of this already. It's very new to me. It's called the 5-4-3-2-1 exercise. What this is depending on what's context appropriate, you'll either name in your head or out loud 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can feel, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. And the purpose of this is we're peeling our attention away from these scenarios and fantasies in our head and just focusing all our attention on the objective reality that we interface with through our five senses. And I tried this out a couple times in the last 48 hours, and I found it to be incredibly effective. As soon as I'm starting to notice like the first sign of getting triggered, I've taken a moment to go through and do this 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise, and it is incredibly effective to just getting yourself back into reality, to being present, and to kind of stop that sudden onset anxiety and that shutting down dead in its tracks. I highly, highly recommend it. In conclusion, we had a really excellent exploration today of negative coping mechanisms that we might employ when we get triggered in social situations. And these negative coping mechanisms are shutting down avoidance and negative self-talk or negative inner dialogue. We discussed how employing these can be kind of effective in the short term of just kind of regaining some control and agency over your interface with a negative situation, but that it leads to drastic long-term consequences such as eroding away your relationship with your loved ones and diminishing your self-esteem, your resilience, and your confidence. And we discussed how we can use awareness and paying attention using exercises like the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise to bring ourselves back to reality, notice when we're getting triggered, but to be able to kind of remove ourselves and not get sucked into that, and to stay open and present. Thank you so much for taking the time to view this video. I hope that you found it useful in some way. Please do let me know, and I will see you next time.